Is Santa Claus really Odin? This is the time of year where a particularly delightful brand of memes are circulating on social media. And that is the memes that identify Santa Claus with the Nordic god Odin. But what is really behind this seemingly weird identification? Because like night follows day and autumn follows summer, these memes are followed by the upheavals of scholars who seem to be personally affronted by those creative ways in which people are re-engaging and reinventing the figures from Nordic cultural history that we scholars thought that we owned. And in this video, I'll make the point that this completely counterintuitive identification actually has something to it, at least something. My name is Rune Jarne Rasmussen. I'm a Danish historian of religion, got my PhD from the University of Uppsala. I recently published a contemporary runic calendar of Nordic seasonal animism that communicates exactly this kind of information, and the calendar can still be procured. Just write me a PM or contact me through this page and I'll send you the details on how to order. Do also keep in mind that there's a general problem in scholarship that early career scholars, such as myself, live under quite difficult employment situations. So if you want to support this early career scholar, you can do it through the Patreon page that is linked somewhere around this video. All right, so back to this absolutely wonderful Santa is Odin idea that is often seem to be spreading through memes that express a certain brand of like popular humor or wit that sort of play on the idea of masking. That behind the mask, which in this case is the cozy candy red Coca-Cola Santa Claus, there's something different, something that's almost opposed. And in this case, it's Odin, the dark, mysterious god of death and poetry, mysticism, ecstatic rays, necromancy and runic shamanism. There's an opposition between these two figures, and this opposition is a kind of masking logic that's surprisingly common actually when you see how identification between figures or deities operate. Now, for instance, according to Christian legend, the Saint Patrick expelled all the serpents from Ireland. Now, serpents are a symbol of evil in Christianity, and this is the reason that there aren't any serpents in Ireland. But in Haitian voodoo, Saint Patrick is identified with what? The serpent deity, Dambala. The enemy of a serpent is inverted and actually becomes a serpent spirit. This is really common in Afro-Atlantic culture and religion, and I've researched this, exactly this logic quite a lot myself. But this is just to say that there's a nuance of this kind of masking logic in this identification between Santa Claus and Odin, the very different, almost opposed figures. But is there also a positive historical connection between them? And the short answer is yes, there is a connection. They aren't just the same, stuff isn't that simple, but there is a historical connection. And I'll just start with Odin and his connection to the Yule, Christmas, midwinter holiday season. Now, one of Odin's names was Jólnir, and this translates as the Yuler, the one that brings Yule, the one that does Yule, the one that Yules. Another name was the Jólföðr, which means the Yule Father, almost a bit like Father Christmas. And there's quite a number of sources that substantiates this connection, specifically between Odin and the Yule holiday. So during Christianization, Odin had a tendency to sort of linger around the Yule Christmas time and try to lure the Christian Norwegian kings back into his sway. And he may also be associated with the wild hunt, an idea that is particularly associated with this holiday. And there's also something about the Yule beer. But that's a bit of a longer reflection, I won't go into that. Odin was also the Grimnir, the masquerader. One of his names, Grimnir, basically means mask bearer. And changing masqueraders, personifying this holiday is almost a constant through history. It basically seems that Odin has had a role as the spirit of Yule, a kind of personification of Yule. And this is obviously only one role that this deity has had, but this thing about personifying a holiday or a season, that's actually rather characteristic of North European animism. People create May queens and May counts and summer maidens and personifications of winter and spring and so on. And even many of the traditional months have been seen as entities or deities. And there is a description of a shamanic experience from a man in Iceland who met the coming months personified as trolls or beings. You find this both in the English material and in Scandinavia. This personifying of seasons is really characteristic. It's not so visible in the Eddas, but very much in the folklore. So the personification of an important holiday is rather typical, and Yule has always been personified and identified with these different figures. So up through the ages, there's been different figures that has taken this role as the Yuler, the masquerader that personifies the time. Saint Stephen, Saint Knut, Saint Nicholas, Krampus. I made another video about that recently. Thorri in Iceland, perhaps associated with the god Thor. Different wild huntsmen and a number of female witch-like figures. Luces in Sweden, the Hulda Pekta, winter goddesses that today we still remember in Scandinavia in a somewhat reduced version in Santa Lucia or Saint Lucy. And particularly there is the Yule goat, a figure that may also have connections to Odin. Yes, while you could even say that Jesus, is a kind of a personification of Christmas. I'm so old that I actually remember people talking about Christmas as a particularly Christian thing, that there is a Christmas spirit, and that is very much Christian identified with Christian values. And this whole carnival of all these personifications of Christmas, in that carnival, you also have our contemporary versions of Saint Nicholas, Father Christmas, that becomes Santa Claus. So Santa Claus is in a sense a very traditional Yuler. He perhaps expresses a different ideology or condenses a different ideology. You could say that he sort of embodies Yule as a celebration primarily of a capitalist, consumerist self-gratification, which is probably why he's candy red and red-cheeked, and perhaps also has a touch of spooky pedophile to him. But he is essentially a Yuler. He's a masquerader, a Jólnir, a personification of Yule. He's Odin, not in the sense that he's a god of Skaldic poetry and medieval feudalist kingship and warriorhood and shamanism, but like Odin, he's a masking personification of Yule. And if we return to look at Odin, then it should also be mentioned that there is a trickster aspect to Odin, an aspect that perhaps also speaks to his Grimnir side, his role as the mask bearer, the masquerader, because the trickster also iconizes the ambiguity that is somehow linked to this whole thing about masking, that there's something in front, but there's something else behind. That ambiguity is tricksterish somehow. And it's very likely that there may have been rituals where Odin Jólnir could have been represented by a masking performance, perhaps in comparable ways to many of these other Yulers down through the ages that come to houses wearing their masks and get something or give something to people. So when people today want to identify Santa Claus with Odin, I think that they're doing something really meaningful somehow. These two figures both belong in different very different parts of histories. They're separated by many centuries and belong in very different contexts, but they're both Yulers, masking personifications of that particular season. And I think that the trickster aspect of Odin somehow lives in this identification, that you can see somehow this necromancer and gallows god and mystic deity behind your friendly candy red-cheeked shopping mall Santa, And there's one meme that I particularly like where you see a little girl sitting on the lap of this ultra cozy Santa Claus, and she whispers to him, "I know that you are Odin. Your secret is safe with me." And I find this particularly beautiful because it is of this little girl. She actually knows the god. It is as if she knows the Jólnir even behind the plastic consumerism, as if she knows the Grimnir, that ambiguous mystery of masking, that it is eternal, it is there somehow also in the contemporary Santa Claus. And well, maybe that's just me. I think it's the kind of interpretation that people are producing, which is very appealing and dynamic, and in a sense it carries a kind of poetic truth in it. And it doesn't mean that Odin was Santa Claus who brought Viking kids presents and stuff like that. Often these things are communicated with historical misconceptions, and that sort of becomes part of the equation where people are making this identification. But there's also a note of meaningfulness, and I think a particularly powerful, poetic, popular wit and meaning in this contemporary identification between Odin and Santa Claus. In a sense, I think it's very Odinic. And it's one of the examples that I see where people who aren't scholars are in some ways actually better at understanding things than those of us who are scholars. So by all means, do continue to let this wonderful and somehow deeply meaningful and trickstery idea grow and flourish. Many scholars would probably be annoyed about it, but I'll be cheering for you. And again, don't forget that it isn't too late to order the Ruining an Animist calendar for 2020, which is filled with all these kind of details. You can contact me through this page, PM, and I'll give you the details for the shipping and so on. See you around.